All right, guys. Chapter 5, Insight at the Gravesite. Here we go. After being on a plane for what felt like a week, Connor and the others finally reached London's Heathrow airport, where they boarded their connecting flight to Berlin. Seeing so many people of different cultures and nationalities traveling around with them made Connor feel very worldly. He was sure he'd return home much more dignified than he left. Dignified, but exhausted, he said. By the time that their second flight had touched the German ground, Connor had slept only 3 of their 15-hour journey and wondered if his neck would ever recover from sitting in a cramped position for so long. I recommend that we try to sleep as soon as we get to the hotel, Mrs. Peters instructed her group as she led the way to the baggage claim area. We don't want to be too jet-lagged for the readings tomorrow. Mrs. Peters, Bree, and the book huggers collected their luggage from the baggage claim with no problem, but Betsy was nowhere to be found. Connor wasn't worried about his luggage being lost, though. On the contrary, he thought wearing the same clothes for the next few days might be worth not having to lug around the decaying trunk around Germany. But just as he had happily come to terms with the idea, Betsy slid down the luggage carousel, making more noise than any other suitcase had. Betsy had arrived in Germany, and she wanted everyone to know about it. The group followed Mrs. Peters through the crowded Berlin airport as they tried to make their way to the Ausgang, or exit. They shuffled their way outside when Mrs. Peters had arranged for a small van to pick them up. The driver was a stern, older man with a plump face and a thin mustache. He held up a sign that said, Peters. Guten Tag, Mrs. Peters said to the driver. I'm Evelyn Peters. Nice to meet you. Hello, Cindy said very loudly to the driver and forced him to shake her hand. We're from the United States. It's an honor to be in your country. Everyone rolled their eyes at her except the driver. Clearly, this wasn't his first experience with a tourist like Cindy, that type who gave tourists a bad name. I'm German, not hard of hearing, the driver said in perfect English. Let me load your bags into the van and we will be on our way to your hotel. As the driver drove them away from the airport, all eyes on the group widened as they took in the first sights of the new country. Seeing his first glimpse of Germany reminded Connor of seeing the land of stories for the first time. They were so far away from home, yet a very familiar world of its own existed here. The book huggers took out their cameras and started taking pictures of everything they saw. Look, it's a telephone pole, Lindy said, and showed the others the photo she had taken of it. It looks just like a telephone pole back home, Bree said. But it's a German telephone pole, Lindy said, as if Bree had missed something. Every street the van drove down gave them something new to gawk at that they had never seen at home. A massive cathedral with gargoyles stood next to an office building made entirely out of glass. An abstract art installation of a balloon dog, was planted near a statue honoring the famous German opera singer. Tiny shops that looked like gingerbread houses were across the street from strip malls similar to the ones in the United States. Berlin was unlike any city Connor and the girls had ever been to. It was a combination of old and new. The monuments celebrating people and events of the past alongside tributes contributing and encouraging thoughts and ideas for the future. Of all the cities in the world, Berlin is much among that has shaped the world into what it is today, Mrs. Peters had said. There is history everywhere you look, some noble, some terrible, but highly important nonetheless. Connor took what she said to heart. He looked out the window and wondered just how many people had traveled there down these streets before him and what their lives had been like. Seems more dirty than historical to me, Mindy said, not showing any enthusiasm. Look at that wall over there. It's covered in graffiti. That's the Berlin Wall, Mindy, Bree said. It's one of the most important and historic sites on Earth. The driver let out an amused snort from under his breath, and Mindy turned bright red. The other girls instantly started taking the pictures of it as fast as they could. Oh, Mindy said, well, there should have been a sign or something. Occasionally, they would see a brown poster taped to a bus stop or pinned to a message board advertising the Brothers Grimm event. At a couple of stops, they found a poster that had been translated into English. The University of Berlin presents a Grimm Fest. Be among the first to hear 3 never-before-told stories by the Brothers Grimm at the University of Berlin opens up a time capsule left by the famous storytelling duo. Wednesday, 12 o'clock noon, at St. Mathias Kirchhof Cemetery. Contact the University of Berlin for ticket information. Seeing the posters around the town made the group even more excited about the readings. Mrs. Peter pulled a thick itinerary out of her purse and went over it with her fellow travelers. "Let's all take a quick nap when we arrive, and then perhaps we can go for a walk around the city before dinner," she said. "The stories will be read at the cemetery at noon tomorrow, so we'll be in the lobby at about 10 o'clock for the complimentary breakfast. Or if you want to sleep in, we'll be leaving the hotel at 11 o'clock sharp. Then, after the readings, we can have a lunch in the cafe of our choice, and I have scheduled a bike tour of the Tiergarten Park." I don't even know what that was. Then on Thursday, we will visit the Brandenburg Gate, the Chancellery, and a couple of museums. On the last day, I thought we could visit some of the local shops before our flight home. They nodded all excitedly together, even though Connor wasn't as thrilled at the idea of spending a whole day shopping as the girls were. Soon the group arrived at the Hotel Gewaltiger Palast, which Mrs. Peters told them meant Enormous Palace Hotel in German. However, the translation really didn't live up to its expectations. There was nothing very big or grand about the hotel at all. It was fairly small and very plain and had only a few staff members. According to what the group could make out of from the photos on the wall, the hotel had been owned by the very same family since before World War II. The older woman behind the front desk also looked like she had been there since before the war. She was tall and thin with curly gray hair and had a beaded eyeglass chain that was probably the most colorful thing in the lobby. Her English wasn't as good as the driver's had been, and was able to still check us in without a hitch. There was an obvious annoyance in her eyes as she helped them get settled. Connor couldn't tell if she didn't like Americans specifically or just people in general. Mrs. Peters helped her pass out the hotel room keys. "Although I doubt I have to worry about anything with this particular group, I must remind everyone that even though we are in a different country, all school rules and policies will strictly be enforced while we are on this trip," Mrs. Peters warned them. "Now, everyone, try to get some sleep." They had boarded the elevator. Wendy and Lindy were sharing a room on the second floor. Bree was sharing a room with Mindy and Cindy on the third floor. Connor had his own room on the fourth floor, but Mrs. Peters stayed in the elevator after he got off. "Where is your room, Mrs. Peters?" Connor asked, holding the elevator door open. "I've booked myself the Chancellor's suite," she told him. "When you get to be my age, Mr. Bailey, you'll learn that nothing is worth traveling for unless you can do it in absolute comfort. Sleep well." The elevator doors closed and Connor found his room. He wasn't surprised to see how bleak the room was. The bed was small and looked stiff. The carpet was brown and smelled as old as it looked, and the beige wallpaper was peeling in the corners. Connor didn't mind too much, though. He knew his accommodations reflect the budget he was traveling on. That sounds right. He tossed Betsy onto the chair in the corner and dived into the bed. It was even stiffer than he'd thought, and the sheets felt like they were made of paper. As uncomfortable as it was, Connor still expected to fall asleep instantly upon being horizontal. But even after laying there for 10 minutes with his eyes closed, Connor was wide awake. He was neither jet-lagged or just too tired to sleep. "I wonder if Alex is around," Connor said to himself. "She'll get a kick out of seeing this room." He opened Betsy and retrieved the small piece of mirror that he had chipped off at home. He tapped the glass with his index finger, and it started to shimmer as it tried to connect him to his sister in the fairy tale world. He stared at his own reflection, hoping it would change into his sister's at any moment. Unfortunately, the reflection didn't change. "I wish magic mirrors had answering machines," Connor said, and tossed it back into his suitcase. He went to the window and looked out at the small piece of Berlin that he could see. A little part of him felt at home, knowing that he was in a part of the world where the Brothers Grimm had lived. Perhaps the Brothers Grimm had met his grandmother and the other fairies on the very street his hotel was on. Perhaps before it was a hotel, the building had been an old tavern where Mother Goose had met them for a drink one afternoon. Mrs. Peters was right. There was so much history in this city, more than Connor could ever have imagined. He could have sworn he felt Berlin's old and experienced heart beating in the ground beneath him. Connor's gaze eventually returned to the hotel, and he saw Bree leaning out the window below him. Both earbuds were plugged into her ears, and she was looking out at the city just as he had. He wondered if she was thinking the same thing that he was. He imagined how excited Bree would be if he told her about the history of Germany that only he knew. Surely she would know then, she would then know how cool he really was. Bree looked up and caught Connor staring at her. Connor froze and his face went white. He couldn't believe he had been so careless. Bree just laughed and waved up at him. Connor waved back, acting like he didn't even notice her. He quickly shut the windows and the drapes before he could seem any creepier and lay down for a recommended nap. When he woke up from the nap, Connor was so jet-lagged he felt like he was underwater. He went on a walk with Mrs. Peters and the girls, and they got a quick bite to eat at a small restaurant down the street from the hotel. Connor tried to avoid looking at Bree altogether. He was positive his cheeks would explode if she caught him looking at her for another second. When he returned to the hotel room, Connor tried contacting his sister again, but still there was no reply. He figured that she was so deep in preparations for the ball. The next morning, Connor awoke just as tired as if he had gone to bed. He was worried that jet lag may have been a terminal illness. He glanced at the clock at the nightstand. On the nightstand, and panicked when he realized that he had overslept and only had 5 minutes before they were supposed to leave. He jumped up out of bed like he was in the middle of a fire drill and quickly threw on his clothes and brushed his teeth. Thank goodness he brushed his teeth and put on clothes, actually. Connor didn't even wait for the elevator. He ran down the stairs to the lobby. He quickly grabbed a piece of toast at the complimentary breakfast table and met Mrs. Peters and the girls at the hotel entrance at 11:05. They were all standing by the pamphlet rack looking at all the things that they were going to do or could do in the area. "Sorry I'm late," Connor said. "I overslept." The book huckers glared at him as if he had just committed a federal offense. "Not to worry, Mr. Bailey," Mrs. Peters said. 5 minutes late isn't a tragedy. "Good thing that you're not a paramedic or a train operator," Mindy said and crossed her arms. She and the book huggers were going to take any opportunity to scold them that they could. "Let's get on our way to the cemetery so that we can enjoy some of the festivities before the readings begin," Mrs. Peters instructed. They had left the hotel and found the driver from the day before waiting for them outside. They climbed aboard the van and all sat at the edge of their seats, excited about their first German adventure. The van hurried through the Berlin streets, and the girls once again took pictures of everything they saw. They drove through Tiergarten Park, which stretched through the center of the city, just like a German version of Central Park, and past the iconic Brandenburg Gate. Connor instantly recognized the gate's pillars and its statues of the chariot at the top. A few moments later, once they had driven through the winding maze of buildings, they finally arrived at the St. Matthäus Kirchhof Cemetery. And although Connor hadn't been sure what to expect, the cemetery was different from what he had imagined. It was at the end of a long cul-de-sac and almost looked like a courtyard to a tall apartment and office building that had surrounded it. A doomed playground sat only a few feet away from the 150-year-old cemetery's entrance, even if it was no exception to Berlin's integration of the old and new. A massive stone gate guarded the entrance to the cemetery. It was covered with traces of dead ivy and had a crucifix at its peak. Although it was the oldest structure in this part of the city, it had maintained its authoritative and imperial prestige over the years. There was something about that gate that just demanded respect. Brown welcoming posters advertising the Grimfest were placed all over the gate. Their van was one of many vans and buses dropping people off for the readings. There was even a couple of news crews covering the event. "Here we are," Mrs. Peters said. She led her group out of the van and through the stone gate. "This place is creepy," Lindy said, and Wendy nodded along with her. They were very hesitant to go any farther inside. "This place is awesome," Bree said, and took a picture of the gate with her phone. It was the first picture of the trip. Beyond the gate, the cemetery was very festive. Everywhere they looked, they saw students from the University of Berlin in brown shirts that matched the posters answering attendees' questions. Teachers and students of all ages from all corners of the globe were all clumped throughout the cemetery, speaking in different languages. Most all of the attendees were gathered around a miniature chapel in the center of the cemetery. A red velvet rope blocked the front steps, making the porch into a stage of sorts. In the center of the porch was a white pillar with a glass display case on top of it, and inside the case was a very, very old wooden chest. Without a doubt, Connor knew he was looking at the Brothers Grimm's time capsule. He smiled from ear to ear. Alex and his grandmother would have been so happy to see him, as so many people so enthusiastic about the work of the Brothers Grimm. "Miss Weiss! Mrs. Weiss!" Mrs. Peters called out to the crowd ahead of her. a woman who could who could only be described as the German version of Mrs. Peters, turned to face them. She wore almost the exact same pair of glasses and dress that Mrs. Peters had on. "Mrs. Peters, it's so wonderful to see you," Mrs. Weiss said, embracing her old friend. "Students, allow me to introduce an old colleague of mine, Mrs. Weiss," Mrs. Peters said to Connor and the girls. "She's the reason we're here. She teaches English in Frankfurt and contacted me immediately once she heard about today's events." "I'm so happy you could make it," Mrs. Weiss said, and looked down at her watch. "The reading should begin in about 20 minutes or so, but until then, please have a look around the cemetery. There is face painting and a short story contest on the south lawn. Please enjoy yourselves while Mrs. Weiss and I catch up." Mrs. Peters instructed them, "Just don't go too far." The group split up, going in separate directions like moths drawn to different lights. Mindy and Cindy went to check out the face painting, while Lindy and Wendy hurried to see if it was too late to enter the short story contest. Connor wandered deeper into the cemetery to discover it by himself. The perimeter of the cemetery was lined with enormous mausoleums, while smaller graves and tombstones were scattered across the center of the lawns. The dates of birth and death spanned to more than 200 years ago. Connor almost couldn't believe how long most of the dead had been buried there. He did, however, have an inkling of what it might be like after flying internationally and being stuck in his own cramped space for a long period of time. He walked along the mausoleums, admiring the pillars and statues and stained glass windows. He figured there must be some grave sites of importance and the wealthy. He was sure he would find the graves of Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm among them. But after walking the perimeter of the graveyard twice, he still hadn't found their place of rest. A cluster of people were gathered around a smaller row of graves in the center of the cemetery. Connor's curiosity got the best of him, and he went to see what all the fuss was about. Finally, he pushed his way through the crowd and saw what all the excitement was for. Everyone was huddled around the 4 identical graves lined up in a row. Each tombstone was tall, dark gray, and square. Connor had read the names on the last 2 in the row twice before he believed his eyes. He was staring at the very humble graves of Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, buried alongside Wilhelm's sons, Rudolph and Herman. "I don't believe it," Connor said to himself. What don't you believe?" said a familiar voice. Connor looked to his right and saw Bree standing beside him. She had also pushed her way to the front of the observers. "I can't believe that this is it," Connor said. "You'd think the most important storytellers who ever lived would have flashier graves. I expected a big crypt of statues of like fairy tale creatures and stained glass windows of castles and gingerbread houses, but this is pretty dull." "I kind of like it," Bree said, and snapped a picture of the graves with her phone. "Very simple and refined. That's how I'd like to be remembered, I think. Besides, I have a suspicion that they don't care very much anymore." "I guess," Connor said. He was disheartened by the whole thing. He felt that the brothers Grimm deserved much more. Bree seemed to find his disappointment charming. "I don't think anyone gets remembered exactly the way that they want to," she said. "You just have to do the best you can with what you have and hope that you're recognized for it. But I doubt that there's anything else in this cemetery that could draw a crowd this size." A horn sounded through the graveyard. Everyone turned to the chapel and saw a man dressed in ceremonial lederhosen blowing a trumpet on the porch. Noon had arrived and the readings were about to begin. The crowd of people scattered across the cemetery grounds migrated toward the front steps of the chapel, eager to hear the untold stories of the brothers Grimm. Connor and Bree walked over together and regrouped with Mrs. Peters and the book huggers. "I'm so excited," Cindy said and clapped her hands. "I hope one of the stories is about an awful curse like in Sleeping Beauty," Mindy said. "I've always loved a good curse." "I hope one is about a sequel or a prequel to one of the other stories," Lindy said. "It would be so amazing to hear what happens to our favorite characters before or after the stories we know." Connor chuckled. He knew, but he wasn't going to share it with them. "Is something funny, Connor?" Mindy asked. "Oh no, I'm just excited too," he said with a shrug. A woman emerged from the chapel and the crowd greeted her with warm applause. Connor figured that she must be the local celebrity. She was tall and plump with a round, rosy face. She wore a bright orange dress with large buttons that matched her short, orange, curly hair perfectly. She stood at the microphone that had been placed next to the time capsule and waved to the crowd. She greeted the onlookers first in German, then in French, and then in English. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to St. Matthias Kirchhoff, I can never say it right, Cemetery, she cheerfully greeted in a German accent. My name is Sophia Amsel, and the University of Berlin has given me the pleasure of reading to you 3 brand new fairy tales written by the Brothers Grimm. They have never been heard of before today. The English speakers in the crowd all cheered. Sophia removed the wooden chest from the glass case and held it delicately in her hands. This chest was recently found in the archives of the University of Berlin from 1811. It was the will of the Brothers Grimm themselves that these stories inside be opened and read to the public 200 years later, Sophia announced. I will read each story in German first, then in French, and finally in English. The stories will be translated into other languages and made available on the University of Berlin's website. Now, it is my honor to read the first story. The crowd happily cheered. She gently opened the wooden chest and removed the age scroll of parchment wrapped in a white ribbon. The man in the lederhosen carefully took the chest from Sophia and held it while she read the first story into the microphone. As she had promised, Sophia had first read it in German and second in French. Connor and the girls heard the German and French-speaking people in the crowd squeal and laugh in delight as the story was read, clapping it at the parts that tickled them the most. Connor's anxiety bubbled up more and more the closer she got to telling the story in English. He couldn't wait to hear what the Brothers Grimm had written about and wondered if it would be anyone that he and his sister knew. Sophia cleared her throat and began reading in English. The first story is called The Kirby Tree, she announced. Connor's face instantly went red. He gasped so quickly and so hard that he started coughing. He could feel Bree's suspicious glare at the side of his face. How funny, Connor said to her when he caught his breath. That's the name of my story. What a coincidence. Yeah, a coincidence, Bree said. Her suspicion was short-lived, though, and soon faded away. After all, what else could it be than but a coincidence? She looked back at Sophia as she began reading from the scroll. Once upon a time, in a faraway forest, there lived a tree that was so different from all of the other trees in the woods. While the other trees grew perfectly straight toward the sky, this particular tree grew in loops, twists, and turns. It was known as the Kirby Tree by all who saw it, and many humans and animals came from afar and wide to see its splendor. When the humans and animals were away, in a language that only could be heard by the plants of the forest, the other trees would taunt the poor Kirby Tree. We hate your bark and your branches and your leaves that twist and turn. One day they will chop you into firewood and you will forever burn. It made the Kirby Tree very sad, and if you spoke plant, you would hear it cry itself to sleep every night. Years later, on the last day of winter before spring began, loggers traveled to the forest looking for wood, not to burn, but to build with. They cut down every tree in the woods to build houses, tables, chairs, and beds. When they finally left the forest, only one tree remained, and I bet it will come to no surprise when I tell you that it was the Kirby Tree. The loggers had seen its trunk and branches twisted and turned, and they knew that they could never use its wood to build with. And so the Kirby Tree was left alone to grow in peace now that all the other trees were gone. The end. The English speakers met the same conclusion at the end of the tale, with thunderous applause. Connor kept his hands to his side. How amazing, he said to Bree with a guilty chuckle. I came up with almost the exact same story that the Brothers Grimm had. I must be a better writer than I thought. He was all fake laughs and smiles, but he could tell that this was no laughing matter for her. Bree side-eyed him, like she had on the plane. Yeah, amazing, she said through the corner of her mouth, but amazing was far from the word that she was looking for. Sophia retrieved the second scroll from the chest and also tied with a white ribbon, and began reading it in German. She eventually finished reading it in French and began her English translation. The second story is entitled The Walking Fish, Sophia declared to the eager crowd. Connor's eyes grew twice in size. He was in serious trouble now. Bree shook her head, and surely she had heard it wrong. Wait a second. Did she just say the second story was called The Walking Fish? Bree began. But before she could finish, Sophia had already started the second story. I'm going to pause there, guys.